This segment comes from chapter 2 of this book. This will be about the concept of desire and its relationship to machines. In A Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari say several things about the relationship between assemblages and desire that are very important. Perhaps none more important than this sentence where they say assemblages are passional and they are compositions of desire. That's on page 399 of the Minnesota edition of A Thousand Plateaus. So Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the assemblage cannot really be understood in the absence of the concept of desire. And yet many versions of assemblage theory try to do precisely that. And there are, of course, some noble exceptions, but there are plenty that really try to separate the assemblage from desire, which is quite frankly impossible. So what I want to try to do is to show why that's impossible and show how, in fact, the assemblage really is simply only a function of desire. Because this, to not connect desire and the assemblage, not only fails to appreciate what it is that Deleuze and Guattari were actually trying to do, it also hampers our ability to say anything new about the kinds of entities we might want to determine as assemblages. And to date, assemblage theory has tended to want to focus on specific types of entities, such as cities in the work of Armin, electricity grids in the work of Jane Bennett, laboratories in Latour, and markets in the work of Delander, to name just a few examples. And these can be mapped as interlocking systems of things, but they are not assemblages. In each case, there is an assumption that it is possible to somehow control for desire and thereby ignore it or treat it as a neutral variable that doesn't require separate consideration. And Jane Bennett in her essay even goes so far as to say that desire isn't necessarily the best category through which to think about assemblages, which to me is just simply wrong. But if assemblages are simply systems of things, then why do we need a new concept like the assemblage to deal with it? We could just stick with the notion of system. By the same token, why adopt a concept like the assemblage and then gut it of everything that animates it and makes it interesting, namely desire? The assemblage as a system of things approach forgets that the starting point for the invention of the concept of the assemblage is desire, understood as the basis for all behavior, human, animal, more than human, and so on. And if you have any doubts about that, there are many examples of Deleuze and Guattari saying precisely that to be found throughout their work. The assemblage as system of things approach exemplified by Bennett and Delander, among others, assumes that the properties exhibited by a given assemblage are generated by the materials in the assemblage. But for Deleuze and Guattari, this is not the case. In fact, the opposite is true. They say desire is primary. It is desire that selects materials and gives them the properties that they have in the assemblage. And the simplest example of this is the way they talk about the difference between weapons and tools. You might take a hammer, for example. In the hands of a carpenter, it is a tool, but in the hands of a soldier, it becomes a weapon. The only difference between those two things is the assemblage that takes up the actual item. There's no physical difference between the weapon and the tool. And this is something that is central to the idea of the assemblage. And this is because desire itself is productive. And this is what Deleuze and Guattari mean by materialism, which is clearly something different from what new materialism means by materialism. For them, it means productive desire. And here I'm quoting, if desire produces, its product is real. If desire is productive, it can be productive only in the real world and produce only reality. And that's taken from their Anti-Oedipus. Kant, according to Deleuze and Guattari, was one of the first to conceive of desire as production, but he botched things by failing to recognize that the object produced by desire is fully real. And Deleuze and Guattari reject the idea that superstitions, hallucinations, and fantasies belong only to the realm of psychic reality, as Kant would have it. If this Kantian term seems surprising, it is nevertheless confirmed by Deleuze and Guattari's critique of Lacan, who, in their view, makes essentially the same mistake as Kant in that he conceives desire as lacking a real object, for which fantasy acts as both compensation and substitute. This is not how desire works, according to Deleuze and Guattari, because it would mean that all desire does is produce imaginary doubles of reality, creating dreamed of objects to complement absent real objects. This subordinates desire to the objects it supposedly lacks or needs, thus reducing it to an essentially subsidiary role. And this is precisely what Deleuze was arguing against when he said that the task of philosophy is to overturn Platonism. This rejection of a central tenet of Lacan confirms what might be termed the neo-Kantian reading of desire, because it means that we cannot define desire in a transitive fashion. Any attempt to define desire as the desire for something immediately puts us back into the realm of lack. Productive desire then cannot be the desire for something it presently lacks. It must produce something. This brings us to the most important twist in Deleuze-Guattari's rethinking of desire. If desire is productive and what it produces is real, then desire's productions must be actual and not virtual, irrespective of whether they are tangible in a material sense. When Deleuze and Guattari describe their work as a form of materialism, it is because the unconscious, as they conceive it, is productive, not because they emphasize material objects. And the key word here is actual. Referring to the formation of symptoms such as hallucinations, Deleuze and Guattari write, and I'm quoting again, the actual factor is desiring production. Again, this is from Anti-Oedipus. To which they add the following important clarification. The term actual is not used because it designates what is most recent, which would be its typical meaning in both French and German, and because it would be opposed to former or infantile, which is how it is used in Freud's text. It is used in terms of its difference with respect to virtual. Now, I doubt there's a more important sentence in the whole of Anti-Oedipus. And let me quote the next sentence then. They say, and it is the Oedipus complex that is virtual, either inasmuch as it must be actualized in a neurotic formation as a derived effect of the actual factor, or inasmuch as it must be dismembered and dissolved in a psychotic formation as the direct effect of the same factor. End of quote. Now, this is a major reversal of how we are taught to think about the relationship between the actual and the virtual. To actualize the virtual, then, does not mean that something that was previously only notional or imaginary is thereby made concrete and real, an idea turned into a thing, for example. Rather, it means that something that was previously only sensual, felt but not thought, is made present to the mind in an active sense and thereby becomes an object. The actual, then, is that which concerns the mind right now, where concern would mean an active form of attention, which could be either conscious or unconscious. What we commonly refer to as a preoccupation would be an example of an unconscious form of active attention. The problem of the actual and the virtual is central to the entire schizoanalytic project, but as is obvious from the brief discussion I've just gone through, Deleuze and Guattari's conceptualization of this problematic does not follow any of the expected paths. It is not used in either an ontological or metaphysical sense, but in what must be called a psychological sense. And this has to be borne in mind if we're not to be led astray by Deleuze and Guattari's often perplexing rhetoric. Synthesizing desire, which is the other word Deleuze and Guattari sometimes use in place of arranging or creating assemblages, is then the basic operation performed by the unconscious, or indeed the mind in general. And there are several sub-operations of synthesizing that Deleuze and Guattari consider, but for present purposes, it suffices to say that synthesizing is what the mind does. It is only when we turn to a consideration of actions and not just the elaboration of thoughts and ideas that we can see the full complexity of this claim, because now the usual distinction between the actual and the virtual must be reversed. The physical elements in each assemblage are not necessarily actual from the point of view of the construction of the assemblage. They are merely the props, and in the case of little Joey, who is Bruno Bettelheim's patient, they aren't necessary either. In this precise sense, they should be considered virtual. And as an illustration of this point, one can think of the productive relation, well known to capitalism, between children's television and movies and tie-in toys and merchandise. Putting an image of Lightning McQueen on a can of baked beans only works because that image is actual for its target audience, i.e. kids of a certain age. In the absence of the movie, and more importantly, an intimate knowledge and appreciation of the movie, the image is flat and unaffecting, merely virtual. And here I'd go a step further and say that it is the characters rather than the plot or the storyline that matters. And obviously these things are not strictly separable, in as much that children give the characters a life beyond the movie. And this is what Deleuze and Guattari mean by a block of becoming, the relationship between the children and the items and merchandise and the characters and so on. Because it's my experience just watching my own children, they don't tend to reenact scenes from the movie. They create their own scenes based on their understanding of the inner life of the characters they happen to like. And as I discussed in a previous segment with respect to Star Wars, kids don't only like the good guys. In this regard, adapting Deleuze and Guattari's work on Kafka, we can think of characters as desiring positions in a desiring matrix, i.e. the assemblage. This process, it seems to me, is neither one of identification nor emulation or imitation, but something machinic, a synthesis of heterogeneities, as Deleuze and Guattari put it in 1,000 Plateaus. The characters are zones of intensity, that is, components of territories. The children pass through them rather than identify with them, and they inhabit them. And this is an important cue to understanding the concept of the assemblage. And it's worth noting here that the territory is the first form of assemblage, which all too often is simply equated with the composition of a set of physical props. So assemblages have a beating heart, as it were, which means that their particular arrangement of things is necessary. And as the little Joey case demonstrates, it remains in place even when the material things they arrange are in fact removed. By the same token, the children who ask for baked beans because it has an image of Lightning McQueen on the can don't need either those beans or that can to be invested in character. Now, invest, as Deleuze and Guattari use it, is a translation of the French word investissement, which is itself a translation of the German word Besetzung, that in English is better known by the Greek word cathexis. Much to Freud's displeasure, Jones translated Freud's word Besetzung, which in ordinary English might have been rendered as occupation in the military sense, with the Greek word for occupation, namely cathexis. In French, Besetzung was rendered as investissement, which has as one of its meanings investment in a financial sense, but can also mean to encircle or to lay siege in a military sense, which is obviously much closer to the German original than finance. Now, it seems that it is this latter sense, finance, that prevails in Deleuze and Guattari's thinking, as can be seen, for instance, in their discussion of the surplus value of desire. But a glimmer of its other military meaning is apparent in the concept of the war machine. If we think about a child playing out the various Lightning McQueen scenarios that they come up with, we can see that both senses seem to apply. On the one hand, they clearly reap a return on the investment of their desire, which, as I said, Deleuze and Guattari referred to as the surplus value of desire. But on the other hand, they are just as clearly preoccupied with their game. And we might say that Lightning McQueen has come to occupy them, or they've come to occupy Lightning McQueen as a territory. It only works because the Lightning McQueen assemblage is actual for them. The whole of capitalism insists that we cash in on our fantasies and valorize commodities and substitute little plastic toy cars we can put on a shelf in place of the exhilarating intensities or becomings we can experience by passing through but not identifying with the territory that is Lightning McQueen. In this sense, then, the toys do not symbolize anything or stand for anything. They are agents of becoming. They help us to enter the territories of our favorite characters and experience the intensities there. But that doesn't make them fetishes. This becoming depends upon the active operation of the assemblage. The assemblage does not make desire into a machine. Rather, the assemblage is desire in its machinic modality. And according to Deleuze and Guattari, that is the only modality in which it can be apprehended. And this is the founding insight of schizoanalysis. Deleuze and Guattari reject Freud's hypothesis that Oedipus is the universal truth of desire and argue instead for what they characterize as a materialist or machinic model of desire, in which Oedipus is just another assemblage. Initially, Deleuze and Guattari used the term desiring machine to capture what they wanted to say about the nature of desire, but ultimately they abandoned it because it was subject to too many understandings and misunderstandings. People didn't seem to grasp to their satisfaction that it is desire itself that is machinic, and though they spoke of a great many different kinds of machines, it was never the meshing of cogs and wheels of actual physical machines that interested them, much less the precise variety of the material the cogs and wheels were manufactured from. Yet this has been the direction of much of recent work in assemblage theory, particularly in its vital materialist permutations. Although Deleuze and Guattari's work is usually claimed as an inspiration, the material turn is in many ways a reversal of their project.